Welcome to the deep dive. Sometimes when you look back at history, you hit these periods that aren't just about change. They feel more like a necessary reaction, almost like a fever breaking.
That's a good way to put it.
And today, we're getting into one of those exact moments,
Mhm.
the progressive era. Roughly, what, 1890s through the 1920s?
Yeah, around then. And it's almost impossible to understand it without seeing it as this huge pushback against the Gilded Age.
Right.
I mean, that era was just unchecked industrial power, crazy political corruption, Tammany Hall, and social inequality. So stark, it really felt like democracy itself was fraying at the edges. The sources we've looked at paint it as a genuine crisis.
A crisis that needed a response. And the response came from this incredibly, almost confusingly diverse group. Calling them progressive feels less like a single party and more like this giant, sprawling coalition.
Oh, absolutely. A very big tent. You had Protestant moral reformers right alongside labor leaders, feminists fighting for the vote, suffragists, African-American activists pushing for civil rights, and, a whole lot of middle and upper class urban professionals,
Yeah.
doctors, lawyers, academics.
Quite the mix. So what held them together? If you've got someone pushing for prohibition and someone else focused on, say, breaking up Standard Oil, what's the common thread?
It boiled down to one core belief, really. Despite all their different goals, they fundamentally agreed that the problems, the corruption, the inequality, the corporate power, were just too massive for individuals or local charities to handle anymore.
Okay.
They believed that only strong, decisive government action could actually restore some kind of balance and stop democracy from completely eroding.
Got it. So our plan today is to unpack all that. We'll look at the tools they use, things like muckraking journalism, the big laws they managed to pass, but also, importantly, the things they didn't address, or maybe even made worse, like Jim Crow segregation.
And that internal split you mentioned earlier, this fascinating tension between wanting to empower the average voter and, on the other hand, wanting to bring in technical experts to run things efficiently, that runs through the whole period.
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit more. What exactly were these Gilded Age problems they were reacting to?
Well, the scale was just enormous. You had monopolies, these massive trusts that basically held sway over entire industries, wielding huge political influence.
Mm-hmm.
The economy was prone to these recurrent crises like the huge panic of 1893. Political corruption wasn't just occasional, it was systemic. Patronage, graft. Local governments were often run by these entrenched political machines,
And living conditions.
often appalling. Factories could be incredibly dangerous, working hours were long, pay was low. And in the cities, you had terrible overcrowding, poor sanitation,
Mm.
just conditions that felt inhumane. Plus, concerns about what they saw as moral decline, alcohol, vice, things like that.
So facing these giant problems, corporate titans, corrupt politicians, they needed a weapon, and they found one in journalism.
Exactly. This is where investigative journalism really comes into its own. It becomes a major force for change. Theodore Roosevelt, actually, he's the one who coined the term muckrakers for these writers.
Was it meant as a compliment?
Not entirely initially.
Uh,
He thought some went too far, focusing only on the negative. But the name stuck, and their work was undeniably the catalyst. It wasn't just opinion, it was documented facts, exposing the rot.
and that exposure forced people to pay attention.
It shocked the public, yes.
Yeah.
It replaced vague unease with specific, often horrifying details. And that created the public pressure needed for reform.
Can you give us a really clear example where a piece of writing led directly to, say, a federal law?
The classic example is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, published in 1906. Now, Sinclair actually intended it primarily as a socialist tract, aiming to expose the brutal exploitation of immigrant workers in Chicago's meatpacking plants.
Okay.
But what really grabbed the public, and President Roosevelt for that matter, were the absolutely disgusting descriptions of the unsanitary conditions. Rats, filth, contaminated meat. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. And the direct result: Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act that same year. It's probably the clearest case of muckraking directly leading to federal regulation.
Wow. So the pen literally changed the law.
Literally.
Yeah.
And it wasn't an isolated case. Look at Ida Tarbell. Her series, History of the Standard Oil Company, wasn't just a rant. It was this incredibly detailed, factual expose of John D. Rockefeller's methods, how he built his monopoly, often through ruthless, predatory tactics.
Hmm.
That meticulous reporting didn't just make headlines. It fed directly into the growing antitrust sentiment. It gave ammunition to the people arguing that Standard Oil was too powerful and that work played a significant role in the eventual Supreme Court decision in 1911 that broke up the company.
So data and investigation leading to action.
Precisely. And you see it again with Jacob Riis. He used a relatively new tool, photography, in his book, How the Other Half Lives. He took his camera into the squalid tenements of New York City.
Showing people things they couldn't easily ignore.
Exactly. Those stark images of poverty, overcrowding, and awful living conditions provided undeniable visual evidence. Reformers used that book to push for some of the first significant urban housing reforms and building codes.
It strikes me that this focus on facts, on data, on observable conditions, it wasn't just about creating outrage.
No, you're right. It also fostered this belief in data-driven solutions. If muckrakers could use investigation and evidence to diagnose the problem, then maybe, some argued, experts and scientists should be the ones to prescribe the solution. This feeds directly into that technocratic wing of progressivism we mentioned.
Interesting. And was this focus only on big business and city problems?
Not entirely. The methods expanded. For instance, you had figures like Eng Poon Chu, who ran a Chinese-language newspaper, the Chung Sa-Yat Po. He used investigative reporting to fight back against discriminatory laws and defend the rights of Chinese immigrants. So the progressive impulse, that use of factual exposure, was starting to touch on issues of race and citizenship, too.
Okay, so the muckrakers expose the problems, the system looks rotten. The logical next step seems to be fixing the political system itself, right? Taking power away from the bosses and the corporations.
Exactly. If the existing political machinery was corrupt or controlled by special interests, you had to find ways to either bypass it or fundamentally change it. A lot of reforms aimed at putting power more directly into the hands of the voters.
What were some of the key tools they used for that?
Well, on the local and state level, a big one was the secret ballot. Seems basic now, but it made it much harder for political machines to intimidate or buy votes.
Okay, makes sense.
Then you get these really interesting mechanisms like the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. These were designed to let citizens sort of go over the heads of the legislature.
How did they work?
The initiative let citizens propose laws directly. The referendum allowed voters to approve or reject laws passed by the legislature. And the recall gave voters the power to remove elected officials from office before their term was up. Pure democratic empowerment, bypassing the usual channels.
And this push happened nationally, too.
Yes. The most significant example is probably the 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913.
That's the direct election of senators, right?
Correct. Before that, senators were chosen by state legislatures, which made them very susceptible to influence from corporations and political bosses who controlled those legislatures. The 17th Amendment was a direct blow aimed at reducing that kind of backroom dealing and special interest control.
And wasn't there a whole model state for this kind of thing, Wisconsin?
Yes. Governor Robert La Follette and the Wisconsin idea. It really did become a kind of laboratory for democracy. They implemented things like direct primaries, where voters, not party bosses, choose the candidates in state regulation of railroads and public utilities. It was seen as this blend of democratic control and efficient state management.
Okay, so lots of effort to give power to the people. But then there's this other current, right? The one leaning towards experts. How does that fit in?
That's the central tension. You have this powerful push for direct democracy, but at the same time, another group of progressives were arguing for something quite different. They looked at the complexity of modern cities, the technical challenges of sanitation, transportation, administration.
And they thought the average voter wasn't up to it. Or maybe the elected politicians weren't.
Kind of both. They argued that running a city, or even a government department, required specialized knowledge and efficiency. They championed ideas like scientific management, borrowing principles from engineering and industry. This led to things like the city manager system.
Where you replace an elected mayor with an appointed professional manager.
Exactly. The idea was that a trained, non-political expert would run the city more efficiently and rationally than a mayor who might be beholden to political favors or popular whims.
But wait, isn't that directly contradicting the goal of empowering voters if you take away their power to elect the city's leader?
It absolutely seems like a contradiction, and to the Democratic wing of the movement it was. They saw it as undermining the core principle. But for the technocratic wing, the ultimate goal wasn't necessarily pure democracy. It was order, efficiency, and achieving the public good through rational, expert-led means.
So results over process, maybe.
You could say that.
Yeah.
They believed that scientific methods and expert control were the most effective path to social progress, even if it meant limiting direct popular control in some areas. This fundamental disagreement, democracy versus expertise, really defines the era's internal conflicts.
And amidst all this, major national changes are happening at the constitutional level, too.
Huge changes. You get the 16th Amendment in 1913, authorizing a federal income tax. This was crucial because it gave the federal government a stable and potentially more equitable source of revenue beyond tariffs and excise taxes.
Which funded the expanding role of government they envisioned.
Precisely. And then, of course, the 19th Amendment in 1920, a massive victory for the suffrage movement, granting women the right to vote nationwide.
We also got the 18th Amendment, prohibition.
Yes, the moral reform wing achieved that in 1919. Though, as history shows, the practical outcome was, well, less about eliminating alcohol and more about creating a massive opportunity for organized crime. An unintended consequence, to say the least.
And tying this all together at the federal level, you have Theodore Roosevelt.
Right. TR really embodied this activist presidency. His square deal aimed to balance the interests of labor, business, and consumers. He wasn't afraid to use federal power, famously going after trusts under the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Trust Buster.
And he intervened in labor disputes, too.
Unprecedentedly so. His mediation in the 1902 anthracite coal strike, forcing owners and labor to negotiate, showed a new willingness for the federal government to step in and actively manage economic conflicts. He really put the progressive impulse into action from the White House.
Okay, so we've talked about trust busting, political reform, empowering voters, but there's a really uncomfortable side to this era, too, isn't there? Particularly around race.
There is. It's a major, glaring contradiction. While many progressives were genuinely fighting for fairness and democracy in some arenas, the mainstream movement largely failed to challenge and sometimes even actively supported the deepening structures of racial injustice, especially against African Americans.
This is happening after the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision in 1896, which cemented separate but equal as the law of the land. So segregation is becoming legally entrenched.
Exactly. And many white progressives, even those working on issues like poverty or education, either ignored segregation and disenfranchisement or, worse, justified it.
How could they justify it if the movement was about fairness?
Well, remember that emphasis on order, stability, and scientific management. For some, racial segregation was seen as a necessary evil, or even a scientifically justifiable way to maintain social stability in a period of rapid change.
Ugh.
Racist ideologies, including burgeoning ideas about eugenics and social Darwinism, were unfortunately quite prevalent, even in educated, reform-minded circles. They saw it as managing society, just like managing a city.
So that technocratic, expert-driven impulse we discussed earlier wasn't just applied to, like, sanitation systems, but to people, to racial hierarchies.
In many cases, yes. It's a disturbing application of that mindset. And this failure, this deliberate blind spot in the mainstream movement, makes the work of activists fighting against this tide even more vital.
Like W.E.B. Du Bois.
Absolutely. Du Bois fundamentally rejected the gradual approach to civil rights favored by some other black leaders like Booker T. Washington, and certainly ignored by most white progressives. He demanded immediate and full equality voting rights, civil rights, educational opportunity.
And he helped found organizations to push for that.
Yes, he was central to the Niagara Movement and then a co-founder of the NAACP in 1909. Their approach was militant, demanding, and directly challenged the status quo that mainstream progressivism often accepted. This was a progressive fight happening largely outside the main tent.
Were there other key figures in this parallel struggle?
Oh, definitely. People like Nannie Helen Burroughs, a prominent educator and religious leader who focused on empowering black women through education and economic self-sufficiency. Her famous motto was, "We specialize in the wholly impossible." And figures like Carlos Montezuma, an Apache physician and activist who advocated fiercely for Native American rights and citizenship, opposing the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Their work shows that the demand for justice and progressive change was alive, even if ignored by many in power.
And what about immigration? Was the progressive view consistent there?
Not really. It was just as contradictory, reflecting the broader societal ambivalence. On one hand, you had figures like Jane Addams and other settlement house workers.
Right, Hull House in Chicago.
Exactly. They worked directly with immigrant communities, providing services, education, help with adapting, embodying a kind of progressive impulse towards social uplift and Americanization. They tried to integrate immigrants into American life.
But on the other hand,
many other progressives, including some who favored expert control and social planning, supported highly restrictive immigration policies.
why?
Often driven by nativism, prejudice, and those same pseudo-scientific ideas about racial hierarchies and social stability. They worry about immigrants diluting the national character or overwhelming social services. So you see this deep inconsistency, wanting to manage and improve society, but often only for certain groups they deemed fit.
So this impulse to manage, to control, to apply expertise, it seems logical it would eventually turn towards the natural world too, especially with industrialization taking such a visible toll.
It absolutely did. The Progressive Era saw the birth of the first major environmental debate in America. The sheer scale of resource exploitation, logging, mining, pollution forced people to think about the future of the country's natural resources. And two main philosophies emerged.
Okay, what were they?
First, you had the preservationists. Their most famous voice was John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club.
Hey, keep it wild, guys.
Essentially, yes. Muir and the preservationists argued for protecting wilderness areas from all forms of human exploitation or development. They believed nature had intrinsic value, spiritual value, separate from its usefulness to humans. Their goal was to set aside vast tracts of land untouched. Think national parks like Yosemite, which Muir fought hard to protect.
Okay, so protect it, lock it away. What was the other side?
That was the conservationists. Their leader was Gifford Pinchot, who became the first head of the U.S. Forest Service under Teddy Roosevelt.
And their view.
Conservationists weren't necessarily against using natural resources. Their mantra was wise use. They believed resources like forests, water, and minerals should be managed scientifically to ensure their long-term availability and productivity for human benefit.
So less about locking it away, more about managing it efficiently.
Exactly. Pinchot was a forester by training. He and the conservationists were essentially the technocrats of the environment. They advocated for scientific forestry, watershed management, preventing waste, applying principles of efficiency and planning to nature. It was about ensuring sustainable yield for human needs.
Ah, so Pinchot's wise use sounds a lot like that technocratic, expert-driven governance we talked about earlier, just applied to forests instead of cities.
It's the very same impulse. It's about rational management, expert control, and maximizing long-term utility through scientific methods. It fit perfectly with that strain of progressive thought.
And where did President Roosevelt land in this debate? He obviously set aside a lot of land.
He did. Roosevelt used his authority, particularly the Forest Reserve Act of 1891, to protect over 150 million acres of public land as national forests. He worked closely with Muir on some things, like Yosemite, but fundamentally, Roosevelt's philosophy and his policies aligned more closely with Pinchot and conservation. He believed in using federal power not just to preserve wilderness, but to actively manage the nation's resources for long-term public benefit. He saw conservation as a matter of national efficiency and strength. So while he valued preservation, his primary approach was scientific management, the conservationist ideal. #outro.
When you step back, the sheer amount of change crammed into those few decades is kind of staggering. The legacy is everywhere.
It really is. We live with the consequences every day. The federal income tax, women having the vote, the whole framework for federal regulation of food and drugs, antitrust law, even our national parks and forest system. So much of that architecture was built during the Progressive Era.
It was definitely defined by this powerful belief in action, wasn't it? This idea that government wasn't just a necessary evil, but could be and should be a tool for actively improving society.
Absolutely. A fundamental shift in the conception of government's role.
Ah.
But as we've discussed, it was just as defined by its deep internal conflicts and contradictions. Divisions over race and who truly belonged in this improved society. Divisions over immigration. And that fundamental split we keep coming back to. Should reform be driven by the direct will of the people or by the rational plans of experts?
And that tension, trusting the voters versus trusting the experts, that didn't exactly disappear after the 1920s, did it?
Not at all. It feels incredibly relevant today, actually. When you think about it, the Progressive Era basically laid down this core dilemma that democratic societies are still wrestling with.
How so?
Well, think about today's biggest challenges. Regulating artificial intelligence, tackling climate change, managing economic inequality, dealing with misinformation. In almost every case, you see this same tension play out.
Right.
Do we trust democratic processes, public opinion, the wisdom of the crowd, even if it's slow or sometimes seems irrational? Or do we empower experts, scientists, technocrats relying on their specialized knowledge and efficiency, even if it feels less democratic or accountable?
It's a fundamental choice about how we govern ourselves.
Exactly. The progressives didn't resolve it. They established the terms of the debate. And it leaves us with that enduring question. In the face of complexity and crisis, where do we place our ultimate trust in the people or in the plan?